Testimony continues in Minneapolis today in the murder trial of Derek Chauvin, the former police officer accused of killing George Floyd. Today, we heard from Minneapolis Police Sergeant Kerr Yang. He is the Crisis Intervention Training Coordinator for the department. He testified officers are trained to de-escalate situations when responding to a crisis. Next, Minneapolis Police Lieutenant Johnny Mercil took the stand. He is a use of force trainer and testified the neck restraint Derek Chauvin used on Floyd was not an MPD-trained neck restraint.
Under what circumstances would that be authorized? How long can you do that?
I don't know if there's a time frame. It would depend on the circumstances of the time.
Which would include what?
The type of resistance you're getting from the subject that you're putting the knee on.
And so if there was, say for example, the subject was under control and handcuffed, would this be authorized?
I would say no.
The trial of Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis is on a lunch break. So for more, I want to bring in Binny Miller. She's a law professor and co-director of the Criminal Justice Clinic at American University's Washington College of Law. Professor Miller, welcome. It's great to have you with us. So what is the strategy behind having these particular police officers testify?
Well, first I want to say thank you, Tanya, for inviting me on the show. I think the strategy for having these particular police officers testify is to create a number of witnesses who can testify about the reasonableness of the force that was used in this situation from multiple different perspectives, because that is ultimately the question in this case. My guess would be that they're having as many officers testify as possible so that the evidence is potentially overwhelming on the question of reasonableness. If only one officer testified, that wouldn't provide quite the same weight. I also think that having, the police chief testify, certainly an important witness, but having officers who are a little closer to having on-the-ground experience and being in these kinds of situations that police officers find them in is also another important piece of the strategy.
And earlier this morning, the judge delayed a ruling about allowing Floyd's friend, who was in the car with him before his fatal arrest, to testify. What impact could this have on the trial if his friend is indeed allowed to take the stand?
Well, I think that's a complicated question. I would think that his friend would be, helpful to the prosecution. One would guess. I saw at least a clip of his prior interview on media closer to the time of the killing, and he would seem to be a helpful prosecution witness. I know there's a question of whether he would assert his Fifth Amendment rights and not testify for concern that he, I suppose, could be prosecuted for something, perhaps drug possession or something like that. So I think it's a bit of an open question, but it would be another person who was close up to the event. On the other hand, he's a friend. It seems that he was quite a close friend, and so his his bias or his objectivity could be more easily questioned than that of the bystanders who have already testified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, this question of objectivity, because I want to go back to what we were talking about right before, because yesterday we saw the Minneapolis police chief testify that Chauvin violated police standards and training. Is this unusual to see a police chief testify in these sorts of cases? Is it unusual to see, members of the same police department, I know that Chauvin is no longer a member of this police department, but he was, testify against another police officer?
I believe it's quite unusual, maybe less unusual perhaps for the chief to testify than for lieutenants and other individuals to testify. But I do think it's quite unusual. I think it says something about how the department viewed what happened in terms of the unreasonableness of the use of force. I think the number of people who are testifying is unusual. Just an observation, and I may, I'm just guessing, of course, but it does seem that there's a bit of a difference in the certainty with which some of the officers testified. For example, Officer Yang, I felt, was very, very clear that this was extremely problematic and not authorized by policy. I felt like Lieutenant Mercil was clear enough, but when pressed, was careful not to draw too many firm conclusions about what might have been appropriate under the circumstances. I can't remember the term defense counsel used. It might have been you're backpedaling a little bit, or a term like that. And I think, in fact, that is what he did.
Right. Although when pressed, he did say, if I'm not incorrect, that it was inappropriate when pressed.
Yes, he did. He did. But it was that back and forth, and if you're looking for reasonable doubt, which I think that's the best that I think the defense can hope for, then that type of hesitancy from an officer who is in fact testifying for the state can be an important factor in the minds of the jurors.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Miller, what will you be watching for? What else will you be watching for as this trial continues?
Several things, I think, and I have to say, I wish I had been able to watch all of it. I haven't. I've been able to watch bits of it, and I really enjoyed watching it this morning. I would be looking for a couple of things. I've been surprised that there's been not much mention of the trivialness of the misdemeanor of the crime for which Mr. Floyd was being arrested, and sort of weighing that against the appropriateness of the use of force. It may be that other witnesses will be testifying about that, but that would typically be part of a continuum. If you're trying to arrest somebody who's behaving dangerously towards others, that's a different issue than arresting somebody for, even though it was a counterfeit bill, allegedly. That's really similar to a shoplifting type incident with $20 at stake. So I've been a bit surprised that has not been emphasized, although I'm not an expert on the Minnesota or the Minneapolis use of force guidelines, which of course integrate the state law, to know how much of a factor that would be. I've been a little bit surprised by that. It's also interesting. I grew up in Minnesota, so this feels like a very Minnesota trial to me, with a sort of a cultural feel of being in Minnesota. And I've been a little surprised that the officers who've been testifying have been as measured as they've been. I think that may be a strategy choice, not to seem to be going over the top, to appear to be fair, to be professional. But you might expect to hear a little bit emotion behind their words, not to the degree that we heard from Mr. Floyd's girlfriend or the bystanders, but I'm expecting to see a little bit more oomph or perhaps emotion in this. But again, you have to look at the fact of who's on the jury and tailoring the trial to what the prosecution thinks would be most influential.
Okay. All right. Very interesting points, Professor Binny Miller, law professor and co-director of the Criminal Justice Clinic at American University's Washington College of Law. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you. Have a good day.